effort to make ideas fun. Okay? I have a friend who studies the 17th century, and she always says, the Enlightenment thinkers don't say anything new, at least anything new compared to the 17th century. They just say it in a wittier way, with a more amusing way. Now, this is an exaggeration, definitely, but there's some truth to it as well. And that Enlightenment thinkers try to make their ideas amusing, and they write in many different forms. They write poems. They're not averse at all to scatological humor, to off-color jokes. They tell their anecdotes with tremendous esprit, with wit. And so they present their ideas, package them, as it were, in a way that contemporary American academics would do well to study, I think.
In addition to the ideas of humanism that grew out of the Enlightenment, political and economic ideas sprang up as well. A specialized cadre of philosophers known as physiocrats made it their goal to understand the operation of economic law.
Physiocracy, or the physiocrats, people who practice physiocracy, are economists, 18th century economists, and they're part of a wider European movement. People talk of the cameralist movement in Austria or Prussia, the utilitarian movement in England. They're people who think that not only should we have moral science, but that we should have political science, that we can make government efficient through proper means. Economics is critical to this. In some ways, Quesnay, Mirabeau, and other of the physiocrats are very modern, particularly with economic questions. They believe, for example, that one should get rid of tariffs, of guild restrictions, and allow for the free exchange of goods, that this will lead to greater productivity, that this will lead to betterment for all.
The physiocrats are specifically a French phenomenon. They are theorists who are trying to figure out what are the constituting elements that make prosperity possible. You know, how can you advance an economy? And in that sense, they very much belong to the Enlightenment. They're interested in progress. They're interested in economic development. But they come to the conclusion that the wealth of a country is entirely grounded on its agricultural resources, on the land. And you could see why they would be French, because France had this immensely diverse agricultural system that meant that in the south of France you had a Mediterranean climate, in the north you had vast areas for grain growing and so forth, so it's very rich agriculturally.
Although by the end of the 18th century, the heirs to the physiocrats take up physiocratic notions and try to apply them to government as a whole. And the best example of this in France is Anne Turgot, who's actually Minister of Finance, First Minister of State briefly from 1774 to 1776. And he tries to take physiocratic Enlightenment ideas and apply them to government, okay, to make life better. Unfortunately, he runs into all kinds of snags. He tries to free the grain trade. The trade in grain in France in the 18th century is limited by tariffs and border restrictions, all kinds of monopoly controls and so forth. And he tries to free the grain trade, and he generates in the process a terrible reaction and is forced to step back. He tries to abolish guilds, right? The mechanism that controls labor, artisanal labor in France, to free it up so that people could compete. Again, a very modern idea, but it leads to a backlash from all those who have any stake in the guild system and many others, and he has to resign in failure.
As we have seen, the daring ideas of the Enlightenment made their way to America, took root, and flourished in ways no one could have predicted. This was where the humanist precepts of the philosophers met with the best economic principles of the physiocrats to create political magic. We've already seen that in previous periods of history, major changes were always made by rulers. Should anyone doubt that ideas are as powerful as rulers, we have only to look at the American Revolution. In fact, it could be said that the American Revolution would not even have taken place were it not for the inspiration of the Enlightenment.
This is the only nation in the history of the world that was invented. It didn't evolve out of something going on since a time out of memory. It actually had people sit down and say, how are we going to do this? Of all the times to invent a nation, I can't imagine a better time than the 18th century. We had the 17th century, the age of Newton, Galileo, Descartes, Robert Boyle and company. So we had that entire optimism of science back there. And then we had the Enlightenment itself. We had those French philosophers. We had the English and Scottish versions. The Scottish Enlightenment had a profound influence on American revolutionary and colonial thought. Thomas Reed, radical Johnny Witherspoon brought to Princeton to bring Scottish common sense philosophy to education in America, doing it so successfully that one student after 4 years decided to stay a 5th year just to study Scottish common sense philosophy, a fellow by the name of James Madison. So we had to sit down and decide what kind of place this was going to be. The results of that labor were miraculous. I mean, just ask yourself, if you were sitting down today to contrive a form of governance and a rule of law that would be respectful of the liberty and dignity of the individual, but in such a way as to preserve the political community itself. Can you imagine documents that are any clearer, any better written than those, by people who had much to lose? They were all traitors, you know. They all recognized that if this thing didn't work, they'd have their heads on Traitors' Gate, do you see? Now, how are we doing in relation to that very, very good head start? Well, we're a much bigger place, geographically, in terms of the population. There are 260, 70 million of us spread all over the United States. We've got television sets and CDs and radios and cell phones and the internet. We've got all of this stuff, and at the same time, we prize neighborliness. We do try to be virtuous in our dealings with one another. Even the most ragtag gang of teenagers out making mischief are trying to do something that matches up with their conception of courage or manliness. It's misdirected, it's dangerous, it has to be put on the right footing.
Although the founding fathers of the Union of States in America all supported Enlightenment ideals, one man, recognized as the author of the Declaration of Independence, stands out as its most ardent voice: Thomas Jefferson.
Yes, Thomas Jefferson is a perfect representative of the European Enlightenment. Now, he's born in the New World. He's educated at the College of William and Mary, but one of his teachers, Dr. Samuel Small, was right at the center of enlightened circles back in England. Jefferson's, if you look at his correspondence, people he's talking to, the people he's interested in, the people he's reading, are all people we would associate with the Enlightenment. And he has imbibed those attitudes and values before he gets to Paris. And then by the time he gets to Paris, what interests him is the advances in science that he encounters there, but the attitudes and values of intoleration and privacy and freedom of speech and so forth, he has those already fixed in his mind before he goes to the old world.
Thomas Jefferson went on to become the 3rd U.S. president, applying to his administration the principles of the Enlightenment that he had learned. So passionate was his belief in the ideals of that period that, in addition to the intellectual heritage he contributed to the nation, he also contributed one of the rare physical monuments to the Enlightenment.
I often point to Jefferson's Monticello as a kind of classic example of a monument of the Enlightenment. It's true that the Enlightenment doesn't leave behind the kind of tomb of Tutankhamun, right, that goes on, makes a nice roadshow, although there are Enlightenment monuments.
The French Revolution began in 1789, the same year the Union of American States was established by the U.S. Constitution. Following so closely upon the heels of the American Revolution, which was undeniably influenced by the Enlightenment, could it be that the French Revolution also had its roots in the Enlightenment?
If you look at the founding document of the French Revolution, the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, there are enlightened and Rousseauian ideas present there, and they're on the lips of people in the Revolution. Certainly not the overwhelming cause, but has to be factored in when one considers the causes of the French Revolution, certainly.
If you look for political theories that are working in the French Revolution, I think Locke is important because he was translated into French. He's certainly important in shaping the very early stages of the French Revolution, when they still believe it's possible to have a British-style constitutional monarchy. And Locke was seen as the great explicator of constitutional monarchy. In the more radical phase of the French Revolution, symbolized, I guess, most precisely by Robespierre. Robespierre read Rousseau like it was the Bible. Rousseau would have been pretty horrified at what went on in the terror of the French Revolution. But certainly the democratic aspects of the French Revolution have a debt there to Rousseau.
Right from the very beginnings of the French Revolution, the people, both proponents of the revolution and its opposers, who want to claim that the revolution is Voltaire's fault. In other words, that the ideas of the philosophes have somehow brought about and caused the revolution. And as I say, the proponents of the revolution really do reaffirm this idea. In the summer of 1791, in July, they bring the remains of Voltaire from Ferney, his estate and resting place, where he was buried outside of Geneva in Switzerland. Revolutionaries bring his remains back to France. And they place them where? In the Pantheon, okay, which is now in the 5th arrondissement, close to the Sorbonne in Paris. But until the French Revolution was a neoclassical church, the Church of Saint-Geneviève. So the revolutionaries take this perfect symbol of Catholic faith and transform it into the resting place of the great men of the Revolution. And one of the first people they place there is Voltaire. There, I think, undoubtedly are links between certain aspects of the French Revolution and certain aspects of French thought. The attack on religious fanaticism, as it's termed, certainly bears fruit, and maybe fruit is not the right word to use. It certainly has consequences, in certain respects, bloody consequences in the Revolution, in ways that none of the philosophes could have anticipated, and certainly wouldn't have liked. But nonetheless, I think there are links in this respect.
The French Revolution is considered by some historians to mark the end of the Enlightenment. Although this remarkable period ran its course over 200 years ago, it might seem like ancient history to young people. The legacy of the Enlightenment survived the industrial age and lives on today. In fact, it can be seen even in our personal lives as we enter the 21st century. We are free to pursue personal happiness as long as we don't infringe upon the happiness of others. Our lives abound with products conceived and developed from our sciences. The application of reason to every aspect of our lives is now second nature to us. And the constitutions under which our governments were formed have immortalized these Enlightenment principles. We owe the very nature of our lives to this extraordinary period of history that we call the Enlightenment.